Hello, and thank you for tuning in to watch our recorded episode of our Webinar Wednesday series, Bridging the Generation in Farm Bureaus. My name is Elizabeth Rico, and I'm Outreach Manager of Leadership and Business Development here at the Arizona Farm Bureau. We appreciate you taking some time out of your day to tune in and hope that we can catch you next time during our regularly scheduled webinar. Perfect. Okay. Thank you guys for bearing with us. It's been a slew of technical difficulties, of course, today. So first we have the three generations represented through who really is currently in our Farm Bureau leadership. So we have somebody representing the baby boomer generation, the Generation X, and the millennials, which are really our top group of leaders in the Farm Bureau. So Nancy Kaywood is agreed to be our baby boomer expert. She works with us in Pinal County, and we're really, really thankful to have her. I know you had a really busy day out on the farm, Nancy, so thank you for joining us. We appreciate it.
You are muted, Nancy.
You are muted, Nancy.
Okay, am I good?
Perfect, we can hear you.
Great, okay. Nice to be here.
Thank you. We have Sonia Gasha with us. She is here from Cochise County. We have her over the phone with us. So Sonia, you'll have to unmute yourself and say hi.
Sonia, you may want to try *6 to unmute yourself instead of just unmuting from your phone.
Okay. Hi. Glad to be with you this afternoon.
There you go. Thank you. Well, I appreciate you working through some of these glitches with us. Glad to have you come in, and I know you guys have had a really busy day too.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Glad to join you.
Thanks. And then we have Matt Harrington, our millennial representative from Cochise County. Matt, go ahead and say hi, and you'll also have to unmute yourself. There you go. We can hear you. Hi, Matt. How's it going?
Good. We weren't busy today. I've just been chilling, relaxing all day.
What? Dang. Well, I'm glad that you had some time in your day of relaxation to join us.
No, I'm just kidding. I just took some bulls to the vet to get tested, so that's why I'm also calling in. So.
Oh, perfect. Well, thanks. We appreciate you. Okay. Well, we're really thankful to have the three leaders come in and speak to us here a little bit later in the Q&A. Each one of these Farm Bureau members have been leaders in some capacity. Sonia and Matt are both presidents of their county, and Nancy's on the Pinal County board, as well as probably about 6 other boards there in Pinal County. I knew who Nancy was before I even joined the Farm Bureau, just from working and living in Pinal County. So we've got a really good range of expertise and experience in all of them, and we're glad that they were able to join us today.
All right, so Elizabeth, do you want to maybe launch into a few questions for our panel?
Sure. So one of the first things that's probably a really good question to kick it off with was, and in no particular order, whoever wants to answer first, I want to hear what you think makes an effective leader, either in Farm Bureau or any one of the other organizations that works with Farm Bureau.
Okay, I'll answer that. I'll start.
Sure.
I think you need to start out slow and understand what the issues are, and listen to other people and develop your own ideas and gain the trust of your fellow committee members, and just kind of work into it slowly so that people trust you.
Absolutely, that makes sense. Sonia or Matt, if you want to go ahead and answer that, either one.
So I have a thought, if I can.
Sure, go ahead, Matt.
So Nancy mentioned that she said the word understand. That's the first word that came to my mind when you asked that question, is understanding. There's so much misunderstanding in our world today that understanding those you lead and those you serve with goes a long way. Understanding their needs, their points of view, what they want to see happen, why they do or don't do certain things. I just feel like if you have that understanding, then you can address needs or lead more effectively if you really know and understand your people.
Perfect. Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Sonia, what do you think makes an effective leader?
Well, I would build on what Matt and Nancy said, in that you need to understand the folks you're working with, which of course is what this video was touching on, and then having the trust of the people that you're leading is incredibly important. I also think you have to be flexible and willing to learn new things, willing to take risks and step out and be willing to put yourself out there. And if you're wrong, own it. But that doesn't mean that you're no longer effective.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think flexibility is something that's really important in leadership. So let me go ahead and ask you guys. I'll start with you, Matt, because you're the youngest. You're in my millennial age group, so I can pick on you a little bit. Millennials are typically known for growing up in technology and having technology advances constantly available to them. So how do you think us as a millennial leader can usher that confidence into your leadership board where you may not necessarily have that willingness?
Am I still unmuted?
Yeah, you're unmuted.
Okay. So that's a good question. And it's kind of funny because, as you can tell, I'm not exactly the most tech savvy person when it comes to actual hands-on technology, but I do try to embrace technology. But as far as like working with some of the older generation, I think it's important not to wrongfully judge the older generation or begrudge them for not always being willing to accept technology. But that being said, I am actually continually impressed with the older generation and how they have been able to embrace technology when it didn't really become a part of their operation or their life until much later in life. Whereas with us, it's kind of just eased in from the time we were young. And so I really think that you just gotta, again, going back to like understanding and look at the big picture. If technology can help, well then let's explain how, and let's be patient while it is implemented and stuff like that. You can't just expect the older generation to grab something and go that's so new to them. It's just not human nature.
Right. And actually, I had a meeting earlier today with Nancy, and something that she said after she watched the video that really hit home for her was that it's not necessarily first instinct for the boomer generation to just inherently be great with all of the technology advances and the latest app and the latest trend, but they figure it out and they learn to use it really successfully, especially as it becomes important to the leadership that they're serving. So that was a really good point. And actually, Nancy, my next question is for you. So if we hopefully get the video to come back up, we'll see this, but I know that you had all watched it previously. So one of the prominent traits that they used to describe the baby boomers was the idea of loyalty. And that usually meant like loyalty to a company or to an organization. How can we use that knowledge at Farm Bureau to help bring in or elevate members that are in that age group?
Well, this can you hear me? There's a lot of background noise.
There's some static. Yeah, I'll go ahead and
sounds like
the other. Perfect.
Okay. Well, as far as loyalty, you were asking me about loyalty?
Yeah,
How-
so that was, remember, that was one of the keywords that they had talked
Right.
about with the boomer generation. So how do you think we could use that knowledge of that kind of encompassing the generation? How can we use that to reach other people in that age group?
Okay, I'm a big believer in bringing people together, and it's really hard on all of this virtual stuff. But I think that as groups, we need to meet in person, and we need to instill our values. Just tell them what our values are and how loyal we feel to these organizations. Like Farm Bureau is so important to me. They keep me informed. And also I've had the chance to go to Washington, D.C. a couple of times and get more training. And it's how do I want to put it? It's just it's been a great learning experience for me, and I've learned key issues. And I just think that just by educating younger people about, you know, the Farm Bureau and getting them involved, like through Young Farmers and Ranchers, and letting them know the importance, because we've got, you know, serious rules and regulations coming at us, and we need our voices to be heard. So I think, you know, we just need to instill the importance of communication. Communication.
I
Communication is so
totally
important.
agree.
Yeah, I think
Especially now.
Especially now. And I just think that, you know, as these young people get involved, they need to understand. Well, I think that they will look up to us, at least I hope they will, and they'll see, you know, some of the traditions that have happened before us and with us, and hopefully they'll continue to carry on tradition.
I agree. So Sonia, I have a question for you next. One of the things that they talked about with Generation X, that's a little different comparatively to the boomer generation that you guys are following, is the loyalty not necessarily to a company or to a group, but it says that when they had surveyed a group of Generation Xers, that they were more loyal to individuals or leaders in their company or their organization. So how do you think that impacts how Farm Bureau can reach out to or interact with people that fall in that demographic or in that generation?
Yeah, well, I was going to say, my first thought is if we want someone to be loyal to our organization, especially millennials and younger, we've got to explain why. Because for my generation, it's kind of in the middle. It's like you said, more loyalty maybe to the person or leader than the organization. For boomers and traditionalists that are still with us, it was to the organization. So I think as a Gen Xer, it's our job to kind of make that transition and help the millennials and younger understand why should I care and what is it about. I do think that with the Gen Xers, like you say, they can often follow a person. And so when we have strong leaders like Stephanie, for example, that works great. But if someone leaves, especially if they leave in poor circumstances, it can be hard to retain those people. So I think it's educating again and communicating, like Nancy said, of, okay, we're all human beings, we all have our own styles, and how to bring that to the table, but also remember what you're in the organization for, not for a particular person. And sometimes it's hard because we all have our people that we get along with really well and other people maybe not so much, and how to you know, transition that and really keep the flow, but yet explain why the organization works really well to the youngers and understand the olders are often, not always, there's always exceptions in every case, but often loyal to the organization because that's what you do, you know. And so how to make that flow across sometimes is, I think, the challenge. So.
Absolutely. I totally can see what you're talking about. So when we're talking about educating and communicating, I'm going to kind of go back a little bit. So Matt, you're the youngest leader that's represented in this group. So knowing that you have several different generations that are older than you that have different methods of communication, first of all, what do you think is the most preferred communication method with your generation? But then how do you work to be conscientious to communicate and notify and talk to some of those other members in your board that are not necessarily in the same generation?
And you may have to press *6 to unmute.
Yeah, so I think that most of the older members of our board have done such a good job at adapting to technology that we typically communicate informally through text messaging or email. And that seems to work out pretty good. I have to laugh sometimes. I even get text back from our older members before I get text back from our younger members. So I don't know, but I can relate to the older generation, I guess, because I feel like I'm an old soul. So I don't have trouble like talking with them or communicating with them, which I feel fortunate about, right? Like I'm glad they're there. I'm really glad they're there. We've had some of them try to ease off the board, but we try to keep them around because they just bring so much experience. But I really don't feel like we have a lot of issues communicating as a board because of the generational gap, fortunately.
Right. I know. I think Graham has a pretty good spread of representation across who they have in their leadership. So Nancy, what do you think is the easiest way or the most common way to communicate with your generation?
Okay, if you had asked me this about 10 years ago, I'd have said in person. But through the years, I have gotten, I'm learning more and more about, the technology, and I really prefer text message or email. And then that way, if I forget something, I can go back and reread it and answer. It's a constant reminder. So I like email or text message.
I agree. In the video that we'll post afterwards, and hopefully everybody gets a chance to look at, one of the things that they mentioned with the boomer generation is in person, and then a follow-up phone call, and then maybe a text or an email. And I feel like I resonate with that. That makes a lot of sense to me because that's how I prefer. I need to have a couple ways of reminding with that as well.
Yeah, and I really like in person to person, because I think you get a lot of resolution by just having that one-on-one meeting or in a group or whatever. But it's always nice to have the email or the text message as reminders.
Absolutely. Sonia, what do you think is the most effective way to communicate with your age group? I know you're right in between the claim to be tech savvy millennials, as I sadly don't fit in that group, or the boomers are said to be a little bit more disconnected. But Sonia, you guys are kind of right in the middle where you've had quite a bit of exposure and familiarity. So what have you noticed with your board is the easiest way to communicate or most efficient way to communicate with them?
Well, with our board, like Matt said, texting is actually really effective, and I think it's not so much because of age differences, but that everybody's out and about doing their own jobs and stuff, and so it's a quick, easy way without calling everybody. But I'm also like Nancy in that I really like to talk to people in person too. I have Coach has tried really hard not to have any virtual meetings. We've managed pretty well, I'd say, during this whole COVID thing. We have added virtual if somebody doesn't feel comfortable coming in person or is, the state staff or what have you. So texting is great, but I almost always end up calling people if I have a question for them other than, a quick text. So it's kind of a blend of both. I will say, I think for myself, I never texted when it first started, but then I have 3 kids that are 20, 18, and 27. so I had to learn how to text. And I think a lot of people have started out that way, in that their grandkids or their children picked it up, and so if you were going to communicate with them, you had to pick up some of that technology. And now that we're comfortable with it, it's really effective.
I agree. I remember when I first got a cell phone, and I only got one because my older brother started driving and had to get one, and you had to pay to get text messaging, and you had to pay per text message. And that resulted in some chores for my parents to buy myself some text messages. So one thing that I wanted to ask each of you to think about, and I'll start with Nancy, and then we'll kind of work our way down the generations. What was something that either your parents or grandparents taught you or instilled in you, or something that you lived through that you think helped influence your leadership style as a baby boomer?
My parents said that once you start something, you need to finish it. And if you can't finish it, you need to be honest as to why you can't. And they're very traditional, and they instilled tradition in me. And so, just on our family farm in meetings, and we're pretty much traditionalists. They also instill that communication is key. Don't hold things inside of you. Communicate. Let people know what you're thinking. And but then there was that saying in the video, "Get her done," and that is so funny because that is so me. And I have a wreath hanging on my door with an iron sign on it that says "Get her done," and somehow that had been instilled in my son. And it's just one of our things. You finish it. Just get in there and get it done. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I totally see that as an underlying theme with the boomer generations, is whatever you have to do, whatever measures you have to take, accomplish it and work to get it done. That
Yes.
makes a lot of sense. So Sonia, what is something that your parents or their generation instilled in you or taught you that you've carried over with you in your leadership experience?
Well, I would say, being committed to whatever task you take on, that if you make a commitment, you need to be there and take it seriously. But I would also say, just from growing up and being in high school in the 80s and whatnot, it's definitely also what's the reason behind it. And that's my personality anyway. If you tell me there's a rule, I want to know why there's a rule. But it's also a generational thing, I think, of I don't have a problem with rules or institutional framework, but I need to understand why it's there. Then I'm good with it. But if you just tell me, oh, do not ever tell me we've always done it that way. That's
true.
This is why we do it, because we've always done it that way. That drives me straight up the wall. And so I think the idea of commitment, and if you say you're going to do something, you will do it. And so, like, sometimes with meetings and stuff, it's like I often will do it the day of, but I do get it done because I said I would, right? And so there's that, but then also why are we doing it is really important too. So.
That makes sense. Yeah, and I think having that mindset of reevaluating and looking at something and not just doing it the way it's always been done has really made you an effective leader. I totally can see that. So Matt, kind of the same question to you. What are some things that your parents instilled in you, or your parents or great grandparents? What are some things that they instilled in you that you've carried into leadership that have helped you be a better leader? I think you have to unmute yourself too.
Yeah, sorry, it takes a second and it tells me I'm unmuted. But
that's okay.
Yeah, definitely a lot of what Nancy and Sonia said, for sure. But a couple other things come to mind from my grandpa and my parents both that I can remember is, and I feel like I'm like this a lot because of them. It's just, if there's a problem or an issue, like, let's address it. Like, let's not ignore it. Let's not get upset about it. Let's fix it. And to me, that's how I try to be in leadership as well. Like, there doesn't seem to be a legitimate reason to be upset or frustrated for an extended period of time. You know, let's do what we can do to fix it, and the things that we can't fix, you know, just try to work around them, but don't let them weigh you down. And then another thing that my dad talked about a lot, and my parents, is that, you know, the world is ran by people who show up, and that was always just, you know, whether it was church meetings or Farm Bureau meetings or other board meetings, you know, meetings kind of get old sometimes, but you know what, if you don't show up, or if you don't go learn, or if you don't go participate, it's hard to have a voice or a say in what goes on.
I love that. I've never heard that before. Words of wisdom. So let me ask you an interesting question. So I'll start with you, Matt, because you had just spoke. What generation, I know you said you're an old soul, so you don't really identify with the millennials, which I appreciate, because I try to tell myself I don't either. So what generation do you most identify with, and why?
You know, that's a good question. I don't know if I've ever really thought about it, but I think about like the baby boomers and growing up after World War II, and you know, just how exciting life was in the 50s, and you know, the war was over and America was on top, and to me that, and back then it was like, you know, you just worked hard, and the government left you alone more, and you know, life wasn't easy, but it was good. Like, you could really just, the world was at your fingertips. Like, you know, the American dream was so real and so alive. And I'm not saying it's not now, but it was different then. And so sometimes I think I identify with that generation almost more, just because of how real life was. You know, it was before social media and before a lot of handheld devices and stuff like that. I envy those that grew up in that time period. Again, not that you know, I'm happy to be here now, but I'm just saying I think that would have been a fantastic time to grow up in America.
No, I definitely agree. I think there's some really great time periods, and there were a lot of great and useful traits that were kind of instilled because of all of those things. So I totally agree with you. Sonia, do you identify with a different generation other than the Generation X, which is where you fall into? You might be muted, Sonia.
Okay, sorry, had to unmute.
That's all right.
Well, I haven't really thought about it. I would say probably not. I mean, like Matt was saying, I think about like the 50s and 60s before the whole flower power thing, and think about, you know, that was pretty cool time to be around, and that's my parents. And then, but then I think about like my kids, you know, it is, I think every generation has had things that were incredible and things that were huge challenges. So yeah, probably not. I think I'm too much of a history nerd to pick one. So.
Well, and when you'd mentioned that something typical of your personality trait and kind of your generation too is the not just do it the way it's done because it's always been done that way. And that type of innovative thinking is something that really is, you know, derivative of that generation. So I think that you're a really great representation of that generation. Which is a good thing.
Yeah. So.
Nancy,
well,
what?
I wasn't in high school, let me tell you. So.
Nancy, what generation do you most identify with, or do you think kind of the baby boomer generation is all encompassing kind of your morals and you know, your personality?
I love being a baby boomer. I just, you know, I long for the good old days. And what has been so interesting to me as I was growing up, I saw, my dad struggle, and then he'd get like a new cotton picker or a combine or whatever, and how thrilled he was. And so, watching the technology change on our farm was really fun. And I loved the music. I mean, I can really relate to some of the 50s especially, and actually early 60s. And I sometimes I absolutely long for the good old days. I can remember my parents belonging to the country club and their cocktail hours and going out there, and all the farmers would get together, and it was just like a great place to network, And it was, times were so much simpler. And the technology has, I've kept up with it somewhat, but in the last probably 10 years, I've behind it. There's so many things that I don't know much about, like TikTok and things like that, and I'm just having a harder time keeping up. So I like the more simpler days.
I agree. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say I miss the simpler days, and there weren't so many rules and regulations, and you could get away with more things. And I'm not saying get away in a bad way. It's just that you had more power to do things without going through all the red tape to get permission.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I just miss the simpler times. Now it's just everything is made a big deal of, and it's, it takes forever to get something done sometimes.
I agree. One of the things that I always laugh about when I talk about being a millennial is that I am very self-proclaimed terrible at technology. And it was something that I should have grown up knowing more about, but I was just, that wasn't really important when I was growing up. That wasn't something that we placed a lot of importance on. So as we get a little bit further and further into new technology, I'm the person who needs way more help than someone my age group probably should. So at least I admit it for myself.
When technology first came in, I really enjoyed, learning all this new stuff, but then it just got out of control and you just can't keep up anymore. You always feel like you're behind.
Right. Yeah, I think that's it. Unless you're a teenager or a preteen, you're always kind of learning after it's already happening. So I totally get that. So one last question I'm going to ask you all, and I think I'll start with Matt because we haven't heard from you in a second. If you could describe your generation in 3 words, what would you use those words? What would they be?
I want to use positive words.
Oh, of course, always.
As much as we see freedom slipping away, I think one of the words that describes my generation is my generation wants to be, or they think they want to be free. I think my generation doesn't like being told what to do or tied down, or kind of like Sonia was explaining earlier, like why do we have to do that kind of thing? And it's just positive thing most of the time. Another word I would say is connection, right? Because my generation is the generation that remembers life before smartphones, and yet was young enough to have smartphones from a young age so that they, utilize that and other technology pretty effectively. So I think our generation has an important role in connecting generations because of that. And third word would be well, I don't know. I'm having a hard time thinking of other positive words for my generation.
Other positive words.
As much as the world is kind of messed up, I feel like there is a certain level of compassion in my generation. And sometimes I think it's to the point where it leads people to be deceived. But I do think that my generation in general wants good things, wants equality, wants to look out for the little guy and stuff like that. So again, I think sometimes it goes too far, but I think in general our generation feels that way.
I definitely agree. I think all of those things are totally applicable. And as someone of that generation, I'm glad you could think of 3 nice words to say.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it would be easy to just focus on the negative, but that doesn't really get any of us anywhere. And I honestly, even though I didn't grow up in the 50s, you know, to hear Nancy talk about them and hear my parents and grandparents talk about them, I miss those days and I didn't even get to experience them. But that's one of the reasons why I'm involved, is because I want good days ahead. And you know, if we don't do anything, you know, someone else will shape our future. So
Perfect. That definitely makes sense. I can see that in your personality and in your leadership style too. So Sonia, you've had a minute to think about what I was going to ask you for your 3 words. So what would you say are 3 words that describe your generation?
Oh, I guess I would say risk taking, in that an awful lot of innovations happened during the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So, you know, I would say that, willing to try that. I would also say, honestly, a little bit paranoid, because we all grew up with the threat, of very real threat of Russia and the U.S. shooting at each other. And my kids are like, we'll watch movies and my kids will be like, why was that such a big deal to you? And it's like, no, when I was a teenager, we really were afraid there was going to be bombs, you know? So I think there's a little bit of that too, of a little bit of trying to make sure that things are going to be okay, you know? Not so much cautious as just wanting to know that we're all good, you know? Yeah, so I think that's my thoughts on my generation.
Perfect. Nancy, let's wrap it up with you. What do you think are 3 words that describe the baby boomer generation?
Okay, the 3 words that came right to my mind were creative, loyal, and determined. And one thing, we had more freedom to and less structure, so we had to be creative. And loyal, we were taught by the traditionalists to be loyal to what you were involved in. And we had a determination. I mean, you were so determined to get it done and do it right. And as a teacher, I taught, you know, 1st and 2nd grades. I loved it in the classroom when I could be as creative as I activity at the door, which just went above and beyond, you know, my expectations. I couldn't do it. I had to be creative. And so those 3 words, get her done, that was pretty much sums up what, you know, my creativity, loyalty, and my determination. And so anyway, yeah, that's what I think.
I totally agree. And what's interesting about each one of the words that you guys said, as you're saying them, because I'm lucky enough to work with each of you, because you're all the counties that I work with, is I can see each of those traits in each one of you that you all described. So I'm glad that you use those words, because I would definitely agree that they fit your generation, but also you guys as individuals and as leaders.
Thank you.
Thanks. So once again, I appreciate you guys coming on and taking time out of the end of your day to work with us and working through some of these technical difficulties. For everybody else that's joining us, we'll post the video on our website for you guys to look at. It's a really, really great video. It's about 20 minutes. And AFBF does a really great job talking about the highlights of the decades and generations, experiences and major events that happen that help shape them into the leaders that they are. And also talked about different ways to interact with or things to keep in mind when you're working with those generations. So I thought it was a really great video, and I wish we could show you, but if you have any questions, I hope you guys get to watch it and feel free to reach out with us. And again, Nancy and Sonia and Matt, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days to work with us, and we appreciate it.
Thank you very much for asking me.
I appreciate your expertise.
yeah, no problem. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. Thank you guys. Have a great rest of your night, everyone.
You too.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.